Spanish America, Spanish exploration and settlement from Florida to California. This topic covers those areas of northern Spain or Mexico that were incorporated into the United States in the 19th century. There were three major things that the Spanish crown employed to extend its borders and consolidate its colonial holdings in these territories: presidios or forts, pueblos or towns, and missions, misiones. La Florida was the first major European land claim and attempted settlement in North America. In 1512, Juan Ponce de Leon, the governor of Puerto Rico, received royal permission to search for land north of Cuba. On March 3, 1513, his expedition departed from Punta Aguada, Puerto Rico, sailing north in 3 ships. On April 2, Ponce de Leon spotted the east coast of the Florida Peninsula and went ashore the next day at an exact location that has been lost to time. Assuming that he had found a large island, he claimed the land for Spain and named it La Florida. After briefly exploring the area around the landing site, the expedition sailed south to map the coast. The expedition followed Florida's coastline all the way around the Florida Keys and north to map a portion of the southwest Florida coast before returning to Puerto Rico. Popular legend has it that Ponce de Leon was searching for the Fountain of Youth. However, it is much more likely that Ponce de Leon, like other Spanish conquistadors in the Americas, was looking for gold, land to colonize and rule for Spain, and Indians to convert to Christianity or enslave. The territory of La Florida was initially much larger than the present-day state of Florida, extending over much of what is now the southeastern United States, including present-day Florida and portions of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Louisiana. Spain's claim to this area was based on several wide-ranging expeditions mounted during the 16th century. Florida was never more than a backwater region for Spain and served primarily as a strategic buffer between Mexico, or New Spain, whose undefined northeastern border was somewhere near the Mississippi River, Spain's Caribbean colonies, and the expanding English colonies to the north. In contrast with Mexico and Peru, there was no gold or silver to be found. A number of missions, settlements, and small forts existed in the 1500s to 1600s and were eventually abandoned due to expanding English and French colonial settlements, the collapse of the native populations, and the difficulty in becoming agriculturally or economically self-sufficient. By the 1700s, Spain's control over Florida did not extend beyond a handful of forts near St. Augustine, St. Mark's, and Pensacola, all within the boundaries of present-day Florida. The native population was not large enough for an encomienda system of forced agricultural labor, so Spain did not establish large plantations in Florida. Large free-range cattle ranches in north-central Florida were the most successful agricultural enterprise. The coastal towns, Pensacola and St. Augustine, provided ports where Spanish ships needing water or supplies could call. Beginning in the 1630s, a series of missions stretching from St. Augustine to the Florida Panhandle supplied St. Augustine with maize and other food crops. The Appalachians who served at the missions were required to send workers to St. Augustine every year to perform labor in the town. The missions were destroyed by Carolina and Creek raiders in a series of raids from 1702 to 1704, further reducing and dispersing the native population of Florida and reducing Spanish control over the area. In 1595, Don Juan de Oñate, son of one of the key figures in the silver mining region of Zacatecas, received official permission to explore and conquer New Mexico. Oñate would become Capitan General of New Mexico and had the authority to distribute rewards to those in the expedition. New Mexico had a settled indigenous population, but little arable land, no silver mines, and few other resources to exploit that would merit large-scale colonization. Oñate resigned as governor in 1607 and left New Mexico, having spent much of his personal wealth on the enterprise. Missions were established to convert the locals and manage the agricultural industry. This is a picture of San Miguel Chapel from 1610, which is the oldest Catholic church built in the United States, part of whose original walls are still standing, and which is still used regularly for religious services. In 1610, Pedro de Peralta, a later governor of the province of New Mexico, established the settlement of Santa Fe near the southern end of the Sangre de Cristo mountain range. The territory's indigenous population resented the Spanish prohibition of their traditional religion and the encomienda system of forced labor. The unrest led to the Pueblo Revolt in 1680, forcing the Spanish to retreat to Paso del Norte, modern-day Ciudad Juarez. After the return of the Spanish in 1692, the final resolution included a reduction of Spanish efforts to eradicate native culture and religion, the issuing of substantial communal land grants to each pueblo, and a public defender of their rights and for their legal cases in Spanish courts. In 1602, Sebastián Vizcaíno sailed up the Pacific coast to present-day Oregon and named California coastal features from San Diego to as far north as the Bay of Monterey. The Spanish had little interest in California until the 18th century, since it had no known rich mineral deposits or indigenous populations sufficiently organized to render tribute and do labor for Spaniards. The discovery of huge deposits of gold in the Sierra Nevada foothills did not come until after the U.S. had incorporated California following the Mexican-American War, which ended in 1848. In 1768, José de Galvez received the following orders: occupy and fortify San Diego and Monterrey for God and the King of Spain. The Spanish colonization there was to establish a defense of the territory and to convert the indigenous people to Christianity. The method used to occupy and fortify California was the established Spanish colonial system, which consisted of missions, 21 of which were established between 1769 and 1833, and which were aimed at converting the native Californians to Christianity. There were also forts or presidios, 4 of which were created to protect the missionaries. And there were secular municipalities, pueblos, in other words, and there were 3 of those established as well. Due to the region's great distance from supplies and support in Mexico, the system had to be largely self-sufficient. The colonial population of California remained small, widely scattered, and near the coast. Once missions and protective presidios were established, large land grants encouraged settlement and establishment of California ranchos. Rancho activities centered on cattle raising. Many grantees emulated the dons of Spain with cattle, horses, and sheep as the source of wealth. The work was usually done by Native Americans, sometimes displaced and or relocated from their villages. Native American descendants of the Spanish rancho grantees, soldiers, servants, merchants, craftsmen, and others, became the Californios. Many of the less affluent men took native wives, and many daughters later married English, French, and American settlers. Junipero Serra, or Junipero Serra y Ferrer, was a Spanish Roman Catholic priest and missionary of the Franciscan order. He was born in 1713 and died in 1784. He is credited with establishing the Franciscan missions in the Sierra Gorda, a UNESCO World Heritage Site in the modern Mexican state of Querétaro. He later founded a mission in Baja California, and the first 9 of 21 Spanish missions in California, from San Diego to San Francisco. Cerda's missionary efforts earned him the title of Apostle of California. These are the missions that were founded by Cerda in California. The missions were primarily designed to bring the Catholic faith to the native peoples. Other aims were to integrate the neophytes into Spanish society, to provide a framework for organizing the natives into a productive workforce in support of new extensions of Spanish power, and to train them to take over ownership and management of the land. Franciscans saw the Indians as children of God who deserved the opportunity for salvation and who would make good Christians. Converted Indians were segregated from Indians who had not yet embraced Christianity, lest there be a relapse. Discipline was strict, and the converts were not allowed to come and go at will. Indians who were baptized were required to live at the mission and conscripted into forced labor as plowmen, shepherds, cattle herds, blacksmiths, and carpenters on the mission. Disease, starvation, overwork, and torture decimated these tribes. Junipero Cerda's singular purpose was to save the souls of indigenous Americans. He believed that the death of an uncontroverted heathen was tragic, while the death of a baptized convert was a cause for joy. He maintained a patriarchal or fatherly attitude towards the Native American population. He wrote that spiritual fathers should punish their sons, the Indians, with blows, appears to be as old as the conquest of the Americas, so general in fact that the saints do not seem to be any exception to the rule. Punishment made clear to the natives that we, every one of us, came here for the single purpose of doing them good and their eternal salvation. Cerda also led efforts to protect the natives from abuse under Spanish soldiers. After a series of abuses on the native population by the hand of local soldiers, Cerda and other missionaries protested against the governor of Alta California, Pedro Fages, who refused to reprimand his soldiers. Cerda then departed for Mexico on October 17, 1772, to plead his case to the viceroy. Cerda set his grievances in writing in a writing called the Representación. This document, which consisted of 32 points, also laid out the rights of Native Americans in Spanish California and protections against the soldiers, placing them under the governance of the missions. Mission Indians enjoyed rights as human beings under the protection of the Spanish monarchy and were recognized as hijos de Dios, or children of God. Junipero Cerda was beatified by Pope John Paul II on September 25, 1988, in Vatican City. Pope Francis canonized Cerda on September 23, 2015, at the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., during his first visit to the United States. Both before and after his canonization, Cerda's reputation and missionary work during the Spanish occupation have been condemned by critics who cite alleged mandatory conversions to Catholicism and abuse of the Native American converts. Native American tribes accuse Cerda of presiding over a brutal colonial subjugation. In October 2015, a week after the Catholic Church canonized Cerda, Cerda's statue in Monterrey was decapitated. On September 12, 2017, Santa Barbara police reported a statue of Cerda located at Southern California's Santa Barbara Mission that had been decapitated and covered with red paint. On November 3, 2017, the statue of Cerda located at the Mission San Gabriel Archangel was vandalized with red paint and suffered damage during a decapitation attempt with a reciprocating saw. 8 Junipero Serra monuments were removed from public spaces in 2020, most during the George Floyd protests. Some were vandalized, while others were moved inside churches and missions to prevent vandalism. On June 19, 2020, during the worldwide civil unrest that occurred after the murder of George Floyd, activists in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park toppled a 30-foot replica of Serra, wrapped in a friar cloak and gripping a large cross. Once the statue fell, red paint was poured on it, and phrases including "stolen land" and "decolonize" were spray painted on the pedestal where the founder of Spanish missions previously stood. On June 2020, a crowd of indigenous elders and young people gathered in downtown Los Angeles to witness the toppling of Serra's statue at Father Serra Park near Olvera Street. Burning sage, speaking of their ancestors and chanting "Take it down," the crowd watched as activists tied a rope around Serra's statue to rip it from its pedestal. Erected by the Knights of Columbus in 1932, the group said that the statue of Serra had become a symbol of Spanish colonization, and which Native Americans, prohibited from practicing their customs and religion, were beaten when they tried to escape the church-run missions. On July 4, 2020, a group of people toppled the statue of Serra located near the California state capitol in Sacramento. The group was among an estimated 200 protesters who marched through the streets of Sacramento. On October 12, 2020, a group of people toppled the statue of Serra located in front of Mission San Rafael Arcangel in San Rafael, California. In San Rafael, in preparation for the October 12 Indigenous Peoples Day protest, a church maintenance worker covered the bronze statue in duct tape and boarded up windows. Media and police were on the scene when a few dozen protesters gathered in front of the statue, which stood on mission grounds just feet from the public sidewalk. Demonstrators' signs included one with an image of St. Junipero Serra with a placard reading "Saint Slavery" hanging around his neck, and another with the words "Land Back Now." Protesters removed the protective duct tape and defaced the statue with red paint. Although some protesters attempted to block news cameras, video shows the vandals pounding the pedestal with rocks and pulling on ropes tied around the statue's neck. The group erupts in cheers when the statue falls broken, leaving the feet still fixed to the damaged pedestal, across which the word "rape" is scrawled in red paint. Police officers stood by during the vandalism, but when the protest dispersed, they cited and released 5 women. Marin County prosecutors filed felony vandalism charges against 5 people after the mob destroyed a statue of St. Junipero Serra at Mission San Rafael Arcangel. If convicted, the vandals could be sentenced up to 3 years in prison and fined up to $50,000. Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone, whose Archbishop of San Francisco includes San Rafael, described the Marin County prosecutor's decision as a breakthrough moment for Catholics. In a statement released November 13, he said the decision to prosecute on the charge of felony vandalism represents the first time that any of the lawbreakers attacking statues of St. Junipero Serra and other acts of vandalism on Catholic Church property across California will be held accountable for their actions in a court of law. Despite the recommendation of the San Rafael Police Department, Marin County prosecutors did not include additional charges of vandalizing a place of worship, a hate crime, for each of the suspects. Given that this was a vandalism at a house of worship, the San Rafael Police Department understandably recommended that the perpetrators be charged with a hate crime, Archbishop Cordileone said. Indeed, to vandalize a house of worship, to express one's views, is not a mere property crime. It is an attack on the identity and the rights of a whole faith community. Unfortunately, the article that I have a picture of here is from 1 year ago, and I do not have an update. I do not know what has happened in connection with the arrests. I know that they were charged with felonies, but I don't know if the charges have been dropped, or if trials have taken place yet, or if anyone has pled guilty, or what. At this point, this seems to be the last information we have, the information of the 5 people being charged with felonies.